The Wanderer's Notebook Volume 1. By Christopher Emrys. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved. Shattered Alliances. Niletyr, plus 637 ER. Calder, the old grey-haired dwarf, sat down on a large rock several yards from a wall of mist that rose into the sky to meet the dark grey clouds covering the land. The rock was solid and stable on the hard ground beneath, and it fit firmly into the tree that had grown around it. He could sit on this rock with his back to the tree, keeping one eye on the mist and the other on rolling forested hills to the west. The sprawling land between the forest and the mist wall was covered with dirt and rocks. He looked up and watched the setting sun illuminate the contours of the hills. Though he couldn't see the forested hills from where he sat, he knew they gave way to a land of hills and streams that had been cultivated into farmland by the hill dwarves. Calder reached into his pack, pulled out a stale chunk of bread, and sighed as he looked at it. He missed the fruit from the trees and the berries from the vineyards. Ever since the goblins had arrived, the hill dwarves found themselves losing farmland at an alarming rate. To see the devastation afterward, the trampled crops, the charred and barren trees, one would think the goblins thrived on destruction in and of itself. No one ever saw them looting or eating what the dwarves had so lovingly cultivated, but Calder reasoned that this was merely a chance lack of observation. Calder pulled his cloak tighter around him and glanced over at the mist wall. He knew this was where he was supposed to wait for the mist walkers, but he was always uneasy around the wall. An expedition had once set out into the mist to explore, only to have one lone survivor come running back babbling about creatures of pure darkness with glowing eyes and endless appetites. He shook his head to clear away the mental images that were giving strength to his fear and took a bite from the stale loaf. The distraction worked. Calder was one of the dwarves of the forest, more prone to wandering than his hill dwarf cousins. He was one of the few that had spent many years developing the mental abilities that allowed him to communicate with the mist walkers, even though they were far away. The hill dwarves did not like being near the mist wall, so not only was it his job to play messenger, but he was also responsible for sitting and waiting in the cold for the elves to show up. Calder looked around to make sure that everything was clear and then closed his eyes and reached out with his mind. Where are you? The sun is setting, and travel will be much less safe the darker it gets. Nothing. Calder sighed and hopped off the rock, preferring to be already on his feet and ready to move if anything were to attack. He began to pace back and forth along the hard-packed earth. The dwarf turned to look out across the clearing toward the edge of the forest. He couldn't see any signs of movement and hoped it stayed that way. A gentle breeze grazed the back of his mind, and he spun around to face the mist. Out strode three tall figures dressed in chainmail. The first elf was a male whose face showed lines of sorrow, yet whose expression was friendly. His hair was white and roughly shoulder-length, tucked behind his pointed ears. His clothes were various shades of grey and white, his demeanor that of a scholar more than a warrior. The second was a female with long dark hair tied back in a braid. She wore greens and browns over her chainmail, carried her bow at the ready, and constantly turned her head and eyes to take in everything around her. While the first had his focus on the dwarf, Calder could tell that the second had her attention on everything else. The third and last figure seemed to be the youngest, though it was sometimes hard to tell with elves. He was dressed entirely in black with a shirt of mail under his black surcoat. The handles of two short swords protruded over his shoulders. His hair was black, nearly shoulder length, and he walked with his head somewhat bowed, as if he was depressed or bored. The lead elf knelt in front of Calder so that they could more closely look each other in the eye. He then greeted Calder in the dwarfish language. "Thank you for waiting, my friend. I am Briad, the female is Adarin, and the young one is Talfrin." Calder smiled and bowed to the elf. "It was no trouble. Now let us be on our way to the fortress." Calder led the three elves through the forest on their way to the fortress. To aid in their stealth, he communicated silently to his guests as they went, so as to best bring them up to speed. 354 years ago, the dwarves traveled through a sphinx gate deep in the mountains and began to settle this land. The mountain dwarves stayed in the northern mountain ranges, the hill dwarves cultivated the rolling hills to the south, and the forest dwarves mostly disappeared into the forests south of the hills. The forest dwarves discovered another sphinx gate to the far south. 10 years ago, the goblin hordes swarmed through and destroyed the gate guardians. Since then, they've been pushing us north toward the mountains. The winter has iced over the passes in the mountains, and soon we shall be crushed against the frozen rocks. When they arrived at the fortress a few days later, they were brought before the dwarf lord in charge of the land. His unpleasant disposition was etched in every line of his face as Calder led the elves before him. Styri, the dwarf lord, sat on a throne at the far end of the wooden great hall. On either side sat his chief advisers, equally distrusting and unsatisfied, though not as old as their liege. "Do the elves think us so weak that only 3 of them can accomplish what hundreds of dwarves have failed to do?" asked Cole, the black-haired dwarf on the lord's right, as he tugged at his beard. "Perhaps the elves merely don't care enough about our survival to send more than 3 of themselves," suggested Ildhar, the red-haired dwarf on the lord's left, as he gently stroked his beard. Calder's grey brows furrowed in irritation. He stepped forward to speak to the dwarf lord but was interrupted. "My esteemed dwarves," said Briard as he knelt and bowed before them. "We elves are not the most prolific of species and have grown accustomed to accomplishing much with as few as possible. We are here to aid your efforts, not to replace or overshadow them." Styri snorted and stroked his beard that was black streaked with grey. "Welcome, O ageless wanderers. Make yourselves at home this night, for tomorrow you march to survey the enemy." The next day, Calder rose early before the sun, only to find the elves standing outside waiting for him. The 4 made their way through the mostly deserted fields and into the forest beyond. Calder picked up a trail and began tracking what was, most likely, a goblin patrol. He noticed that the female elf seemed to be tracing the trail farther off into the distance than his old eyes could see, but she kept quiet. The old dwarf grunted and kept going. It was most likely her way of showing him respect and not trying to overshadow him, but he still felt pangs of jealousy at his own limitations. After some time, they crept up a small rise, keeping themselves low to the ground. As they peered around the trees and over the edge, they saw the goblin camp. The creatures were a little taller than dwarves with thinner, faster bodies that were mostly dark green splotched with shades of dark red. Goblins tended to travel in small groups of about 50 to 100 so that they could easily raid the dwellings of their enemies and disappear again into the night. On their own, they rarely fought in large armies unless accompanied by much larger or more foul creatures. This particular group lacked any of these unwelcome additions, which gave Calder at least some small reason to be thankful. The 4 carefully backed away from the edge and huddled together. "We can go back to the fort and get reinforcements," suggested Calder silently. "That will take too long and runs the risk of them moving or catching us on the way back." "Let me do it. I can kill them all," returned the black-clad elf, for the first time uttering any words and showing a strange intensity as he did so. "What's with this nonsense?" questioned Calder. "You can't kill 50 goblins by yourself. Those that don't kill you will escape, and the advantage of surprise will be lost." The older male elf looked at the female who nodded, then he turned back to Calder and readied his bow. "Adarin will release the young one, and we will pick off any who try to escape. Stay hidden and bring word to your people should we fall." "We won't," commented the young elf who took a stance, crouched on all 4s, ready to climb back up the ridge and pounce like a hungry cat. Calder shook his head in amazement and irritation. These damn elves were far too full of themselves, but before he could protest, he heard a sharp command from the female and instantly the young one was gone. The other 2 elves took positions quickly on the top of the ridge and began turning this way and that, firing arrows at enemies Calder could not see. Shamed by their foolish bravery, Calder climbed back up as quickly as he could and stopped dead in his tracks when he reached the top. The young elf had caught most of the goblins by surprise, and some could still be seen rubbing the sleep from their eyes as they stumbled from their tents. The black-clad elf had drawn his 2 short swords and was quickly and gracefully cutting down every goblin he came across. As the goblins began to rush him, his twin swords lit up with blue flame and he moved quicker than before. Any who tried to flee were shot down by Briard and Adarin. None could get behind the young elf as he twisted and spun through the camp, constantly changing direction in time to avoid a strike or behead an enemy. Calder watched in amazement as the goblin camp was destroyed. When the last goblin was slain, the young elf turned to look back at the three of them, his hair disheveled and sweat on his brow, but a smile across his lips. The old elf sat down on the ground with a sigh and a pained expression. "I think we owe you an explanation," said Briad as an astounded Calder looked at him. "This is Talfrin, first of the Dark Elves, and one of the living weapons of the Elvish Alliance." Calder wiped the sweat from his brow as he stopped shoveling to enjoy the breeze as it swept across the Forth in a series of trenches they were digging around the fort. Upon advice from the elves, the dwarves had modified their fort into a star-like pattern, so sections of the walls could more easily defend the territory in front of other walls. This outer wall was then ringed by ditches in which were spikes, caltrops, and bear traps. The white-haired male elf gained some respect among the dwarves when he rolled up his sleeves and began helping them build the walls and dig the ditches. The dwarf lord and his counselors oversaw the projects and were not so fond of the goodwill that their people showed the older elf. Even more to his credit, the elf seemed to prefer the construction projects to the battles. The few skirmishes Calder had observed Briad in revealed a deep sadness and pain each time he killed. It stood in stark contrast to the sadistic grin of pleasure the young one had when he destroyed. Calder had asked Briad about this at one point. "I am old enough to remember a time before the wars and deaths. I have seen far too many of my people slain." "What about the huntress who guards your backs?" Calder asked. "She is a wood elf, while I am a high elf. I'm not sure if she's old enough to remember the times before our exile, but even so, the wood elves were always more predatory than we were, so it likely doesn't faze them as much." "And what of the young one?" "He is the first dark elf," Briad sighed. "A product of the endless death that seems to surround us now. He has an incredible natural talent for killing and enjoys that more than any sentient being should. His dark gift made him an excellent choice to become the Council's weapon." Calder paused, considering the politeness of his next question. "You say, first. Does that mean there are more dark elves?" "Yes. They are a common occurrence these days among our progeny. They have been instrumental in our endeavors against the enemy. Since Cypheriad returned and the outer alliances were formed, they have been deployed to fight on many fronts." Calder had pondered this over the past few days as they worked tirelessly on the construction projects. He wondered at the wisdom of using one's descendants to fight the battles you no longer had the stomach for. Mostly, he wondered what feeding that darkness inside the young one would do to him one day. Though outright murder and assault were rare among the dwarves, Calder had lived long enough to see jealousy, rage, or hatred twist someone's heart to murderous intent. He shook his head at the thought and returned to digging. The female elf and the dark one had led a small group of dwarves into the forests to track, distract, or eliminate any goblin raiding parties until the preparations were complete. The end goal of these projects was to lead a raid against the horde that surrounded the remains of the Sphinx Gate, lead them back to the fortress, and keep them occupied while another, smaller group would slip in and destroy the gate for good. That was the only way to make sure the goblins stopped coming. As night fell, Calder trudged wearily back to the Great Hall after finishing the last of the traps in the fourth trench and covering them with leaves. A greeting of cheers rose behind him, and he turned to see the other dwarves welcoming the raiding party back for the night. The dark elf was still smiling and seemed to be chatting uncharacteristically with his dwarven companions. After cleaning himself up, Calder joined the other dwarves in the Great Hall, sitting in a relatively quiet corner where he could observe without being bothered. The high elf and the wood elf sat in their own corner, eating their food and keeping to themselves. The dark elf sat with the other warriors who had returned with him and a crowd of eager ears waiting to hear tales of their battles, since they had been gone for a couple weeks at this point. Dwarven revelry was frequently drunk and rough by some standards, the dwarves enjoying a friendly brawl from time to time. Calder had never seen an elf take part in either, but the dark elf seemed to enjoy the interruptions of his meal to grapple or fight his comrades. His eyes shifted to Styrai and his counselors, eating their food and eyeing the festivities surrounding the dark elf with jealous glares. The next day Calder readied himself to go out with the diversion and infiltration groups, but he was stopped by the high elf. "I would like to ask you to stay behind and help coordinate the battle," Briad requested, kneeling in front of the dwarf. Calder grunted. I'm not so old that I can't fight. That is not the issue. If you allow me, I can further open your mind so that you are connected to all three of us and can monitor and convey the situation among us. During the battles we will not have the time or concentration to communicate remotely. Do you accept? The dwarf kicked the dirt and grumbled under his breath. He did not want to be left behind, but refusing would be a shameful sign of his own insecurities. Fine. I will send my counselors, and you can link their minds to mine, declared the dwarf lord, walking up to the two of them. They turned to look at Styrai, dressed in the finest, most ornately decorated armor Calder had seen among his people. The armor, unlike that of most of the other dwarves, was without scratch, dent, or hint of dirt. Friend, Calder has had extensive training that makes him much more suited for this than you, though I am sure, with the proper training, you would be able to attain such skill, interjected Briad. The corner of the dwarf lord's nostrils flared slightly, but he relented. Very well. I shall send them as my emissaries in each party so that our soldiers are not without leadership, should the unthinkable happen on their missions. Briad bowed his head to the dwarf lord. Thank you for your understanding and generosity. He turned back to Calder. Are you ready? The dwarf nodded. The high elf swiftly grabbed Calder by the top of the head, squeezed his fingers, and closed his eyes. The dwarf's mind erupted into a chaos of visions. The view from the top of the walls looking down on the ground, a group of dwarves readying to leave through the main gate, and an agonized old dwarf collapsing to his knees. Slowly the pain subsided, and his vision returned to the world before him. The high elf opened his eyes and released him. Stay away from the main fight so you can concentrate, Briad instructed. If any of our missions fail, let the dwarf lord know so the plans can be modified. Calder mumbled while rubbing his head and wandered off to find a place to sit down. He could feel Styrai's gaze on his back and the gentle breeze moving around him. Calder alternated between watching through the eyes of the wood elf and the high elf as they led their respective missions. Adarin led a group of dwarves in a straightforward march to the broken Sphinx gate, while Briad led another group in a wide arch to arrive at the east side of the gate. Both groups rode ponies to quicken their pace, though they did not push them hard so that they'd have strength and speed left over for the next part of the plan. Their journeys were uneventful, yet Calder couldn't help but feel the adrenaline begin to pump through him the closer they got. If they were attacked or spotted before they reached their targets, then the whole plan would collapse. Adarin and her team reached their destination and hid behind the trees, having left their ponies several hundred yards behind. She looked out into the distance, and Calder saw the ruins of the gate surrounded by the camp of the enemy. A few patrols could be seen standing idly here and there. His vision shifted to Briad taking a similar position on foot with his team far to the east and even farther from the camp. Calder watched as Adarin stepped from behind a tree, notched her first arrow, and released in one smooth motion. A goblin lookout dropped dead. She turned and repeated this process 3 more times, eliminating the closest lookouts before turning and motioning to the dwarves to follow her. They approached the enemy camp, and Calder could see in amazing clarity the goblins, trolls, and wyverns milling about the camp in a large clearing that had been cut and smashed out of the surrounding forest. The green and red goblins patrolled the camp. The wyverns, dragon-like creatures with 2 wings, 2 hind limbs, and a tail, appeared to be grazing on a recent kill. The large, misshapen trolls mostly sat in tents or under awnings, lest the thick haze of clouds overhead should part and the sun turn them to stone. Calder hadn't realized how strong this group was, but he sensed no surprise from the wood elf. She fired 10 swift shots into the camp, dropping 10 goblins in swift succession. A roar arose amid the enemy, and the trolls, goblins, and wyverns turned their attention toward the group, rushing forward to destroy them. The dwarves readied small crossbows and fired once the first goblins were in range. The wood elf took several carefully aimed shots, blinding the first 2 trolls and a wyvern. The enemy was then split between those having to deal with their blind, flailing companions, and those still running for their weapons and armor. Adarin and her group took advantage of this and retreated. They stopped just within sight of the nearest goblins and reloaded their crossbows, preparing to fight again. The goblins slowed as they approached crossbow bolt range and sent the trolls and wyverns ahead of them. The trees were too close together for the wyverns to take to the air, but they were still dangerous on the ground. Aderin raised her bow quickly to blind the nearest ones when a large object crashed through the branches overhead. She barely dodged a wyvern that had dived straight through the branches and into the ground. Dwarves were knocked aside as the creature flailed its wings and tail. They righted themselves as quickly as they could and fired their crossbow bolts into the creature. The nearest dwarves rushed forward and finished it off with their axes and war hammers. Calder saw the elf's vision spin back toward a rushing sound to see goblins starting to run at them as soon as the crossbows had been released. The elf shouted a command, and the dwarves took off as fast as they could. She stood her ground and began picking off as many goblins as she could before they got too close. At the last moment possible, she turned and ran. The wood elf and her companions continued running, stopping only to shoot arrows or throw hatchets at their pursuers. The distance between them quickly diminished as the dwarves could not run as fast as their enemies. They barely managed to make it to the ponies they'd left tied along the path. Once mounted, they were able to pick up speed and put more distance between them and the foul creatures. Calder's attention slammed back into his immediate surroundings. "The decoy mission has been successful," he shouted up to the troops on the walls. The dark elf's head snapped up from staring at the ground, and he looked intently at the forest edge. The dwarf lord shouted orders and made his way up to the top of the wall. Calder focused as the world around him faded into the edge of a wide clearing filled with abandoned tents and campfires surrounding the ruins of the shattered Sphinx Gate. Briad led the dwarves quietly into the camp, his sword drawn and ready. They checked every tent as they went, though they only had to slay a handful of goblins. Everyone's head was on a swivel, their eyes darting from one shadow or corner to the next, waiting for as of yet unseen enemies to attack. The center of the camp left a wide circle around the broken Sphinx Gate. Briad watched the dwarves reach out in wonder at the shattered gate guardians. They had been made of a kind of stone that contained a high concentration of various metals, giving them a unique hue and texture. He could make out just enough details from the broken stone to account for the 4 griffins and 3 sphinxes that usually guarded the gate. Calder had never seen the gate guardians shattered before, but he sensed concern and familiarity with the sight from the elf. It was said these apparent statues would come to life to prevent armies entering or leaving a gate. Briad searched through the rubble until he found the shattered heads of the sphinxes. The blue crystal eyes were gone as were the red ones from the griffins. He made his way to the gate's main platform that stood as a large round disc composed of 15 concentric metal rings. Each ring was engraved with various symbols from a language that had yet to be identified. A disc about 6 feet across laid in the center of these 15 rings. The disc was an intricate metal lattice through which could be seen the hints of gears, gems, stones, lenses and wires. Briad approached the central disc and looked up to see a bird alight on the other side. Calder watched in amazement as the wisps of yellow-brown flame swirled around the bird, and it grew into the form of a man. The man's eyes were red-orange with yellow-brown flame-like swirls around the edge of the irises, creating an overall amber appearance. The man's hair was jet black. Calder did not recognize his accent or the clothes he wore. "Those stupid creatures are too easily distracted, but I can't let you destroy this gate," the stranger said while stepping forward. "Your presence answers the question of how mere goblins could have destroyed the gate so thoroughly," commented Briad. "Their wish was my pleasure," said the amber-eyed man with a smile, holding out his hands as if gesturing to the world around him. "There's no problem we Jinn can't solve." His eyes hardened and his brow furrowed. "They paid me handsomely to destroy the gate, but I'll kill you for free." The amber-eyed Jinn looked at the dwarves, who had all raised their crossbows toward him. He looked back at the elf. "More unwitting pawns?" "They are not pawns. The goblins attacked them first, and we came to their aid." "Really?" The Jinn turned to the dwarves. "You don't need to fight and die in their wars. They suffer because they chose the wrong side, and all who join them suffer the same. My people were no different. Their enemy will gladly welcome you." The enemy was always a murderer, even from the beginning. The Jinn snorted. "You're one to talk," he said, and a torrent of fire spewed from his outstretched hand. Briad dived and rolled out of the way, shouting for the dwarves to stay back as he came to his feet. Cole ordered the dwarves to fire, but their crossbow bolts were consumed by the djinn's yellow-brown flames that swirled around him as the missiles approached. Only then did he order the retreat. The high elf stretched out his left hand, and an invisible force accelerated the air between him and the djinn. The airflow became a wind strong enough to dissipate the flames and long enough for him to leap at his opponent with his sword. The djinn shifted into the form of a bird to dodge the attack, and began to fly upward. Briad reached up with his left hand, clenched his fist, and pulled downward. The bird slammed into the ground and shifted back into the form of a man. He reached out toward Briad, but the elf stepped on his hand and put his blade to the djinn's throat. "Please surrender. I have no desire to slay you," he pleaded. The djinn looked up with a smile. "I doubt that. I will never stop trying to kill your people for what they did to mine. And even if you kill me, you won't be able to stop the inevitable." Briad heard a click and turned to see a device that had been hidden by the rubble. Its gears began to whir and the rings of the gate began to spin and lock into place. He slammed his sword straight down through the djinn's throat until it was firmly embedded in the earth. Not turning to see the results, he leaped toward the device, his hand outstretched to stop it, but it was too late. The last ring clicked into place, and the gate began to hum. "Get as far away from here as you can and don't look back," he shouted as he rushed to the center of the gate. A small orb of swirling colors had begun to form in the center of the main disc. Briad quickly knelt down beside it and placed his right palm over the disc. Calder's view of events turned black as Briad closed his eyes, though he was sure he saw a brief glimpse of white light shining out from under the elf's hand just before his eyes shut. A long moment passed, and Calder could see the silhouette of the elf's hand, though everything was tinted slightly red with very thin red lines. It took him a moment to realize that the light had become so bright that he was seeing the elf's hand through his eyelids. A moment later, everything went blindingly white. Calder closed his eyes and covered them with his hands reflexively before realizing that such efforts could not shield his mind's eye. The light faded, and Calder could see the elf's vision attempt to return, but everything was faint and out of focus even though his eyes seemed to be open. He got the impression that the elf had collapsed onto his knees and had hunched forward. Several minutes passed before the sounds of dwarven footsteps reached the elf's ears. "He destroyed the portal generator," said one dwarf in amazement. "Turned it to slag," whispered another. A set of footsteps approached closer than the others, and Calder could hear the voice of Cole to his left. "The djinn claimed that your kind brought this war on them and you have this type of power, but you refused to use it," seethed the dwarf. "You risked our lives needlessly." "It's not like that," the elf struggled to say, weakly raising his torso and turning toward the dwarf who now came slightly more into focus. "The enemy has twisted." "Enough of your elvish lies," interrupted the dwarf. "We will not be your pawns any longer, nor will you get the chance to use this power against us." A vague shadow shifted in the elf's vision, and Calder's connection shattered abruptly. He doubled over and vomited on the ground. A horn blared, signaling the arrival of the decoy squad, and a guard rushed over to his side. Were they able to get to the gate? Calder closed his eyes, trying to will the nausea away. "Yes, it is destroyed," he choked out before stumbling away from the walls to find a place to rest. Tears streamed down his face, while the vile urge to vomit at the back of his throat was mixed with the tightening of sorrow. He knew what had happened. He could hear the gates opening and the decoy squad returning, but he also knew that now was not the time. The elves would learn the truth, but first they must survive the battle. Calder stumbled along until he found a small shed filled with hay for the ponies. He collapsed into the pile and let his mind drift into oblivion. Calder's restless sleep was filled with images from the battle. His vision rose swiftly up the steps to reach the wall, focusing momentarily on the dark elf stationed there. Calder could see the wood elf reach the top of the wall, look at the dark elf, and say something in Elvish. The dark elf's gaze shifted back to the forest edge as the goblins and trolls burst forth. He could hear the wood elf shouting orders for the dwarves to ready ballistas that had been set up on the inner corners of the spiked fortress walls. A moment later, wyverns stepped out of the tree line and took flight. There were only 5 left after the decoy's previous battle, and as they flew up, the ballistas fired. Calder tossed and turned as he watched the large bolts soar through the air toward the wyverns that focused mostly on gaining altitude. 3 were slain. The 2 remaining wyverns swept in great arcs until they came at the ballistas from the sides, while the dwarves struggled to reload and rotate them. Aderin shouted for the dwarves to focus on the one coming from the east, while she and the young one took the one from the west. The dark elf readied his own bow and waited for the wyvern to come into range. As soon as it did, he released, as did Aderin. The arrows of both elves pierced the eyes of the wyvern. It flailed in the air in pain before losing its bearings and crashing inside the fortress. Calder's view turned to follow the winged beast's fall to the ground. The creature was soon set upon by dwarven soldiers piercing its sides with pikes. Calder's sleeping body thrashed as he looked quickly to the far side of the fortress in time to see the other wyvern crashing into the ground outside the walls, its wings torn to shreds by the dwarves' crossbow bolts. The ballista had been reloaded and now fired down into the creature, impaling it to the ground. Ignoring the screams of the dying monsters and the cheers of the dwarves, the dark elf turned back toward the approaching army. By now the goblins and the handful of trolls had discovered the spikes in the trenches surrounding the fort. Those who came second found a quick solution to the hazardous terrain, stomped their wounded allies into the ground so that their corpses could be used to safely bridge the gap, while the trolls leaped from one ridge to the next, or at least tried their best. Orders were shouted and ballistas were aimed down toward the advancing trolls. Some shots were successful, but some missed. 2 trolls made it between 2 spikes in the fortress walls formation, placing them too close for the ballistas to hit them. The dwarves surged along the walls and readied their crossbows. They fired and reloaded as quickly as they could, but the trolls rushed the inner meeting of the wall spikes. The great beasts grasped, tore, and beat at the wall. The dark elf rushed to the edge of the wall and stopped. He looked at the wood elf who shouted a command, and he leaped from the wall, drawing his swords in midair. As he descended toward the first troll, he flipped the blades so that they pointed down as if to stab, and then they burst into blue flame. The burning blades sunk deep into the back and shoulders of the first troll. As it staggered backward and tried to reach for him, the dark elf shifted his weight to the left, freed the blade in his right hand, and sank it into the troll's skull. He barely managed to avoid being crushed as the lifeless creature fell backward to the ground. The second troll reached into the gap they had made in the wall, pulled free a broken beam, and turned to swing it at the elf. As the makeshift cudgel swung toward him, the dark elf charged, dove forward, and rolled under the creature. He spun up and out of his roll, slashing the tendons across the back of the beast's ankles and knees. It began to wobble on unsteady legs. The elf ran toward the wall, took a few running steps up its surface, and then pushed off, twisting in midair so that he again hooked his blades into the troll. The force of the impact knocked the troll forward. The troll tried to catch himself with his hands rather than reach for his attacker. As it fell, the dark elf freed his left blade and flipped it back into its normal blade-up position, bringing it to his right shoulder. When the creature's hands hit the ground, the elf swung his blade in an arc and severed the creature's head. The dark elf rose from the corpse and looked up to see the goblin lines being slowed slightly by a rain of bolts and arrows. Calder's eyes darted beneath his closed lids as he watched the line getting closer. He could see that the time it took to reload allowed those who survived to trample their fallen in order to get closer to their prey. The dark elf rushed forward to meet the first of the goblins to approach the gap. Calder wondered if it was a strategy to keep them away from the breach as long as possible, or if it was merely the young elf's desire to kill that motivated him. The elf sliced and turned, twisted and spun, stabbed and cut as the goblins kept charging. A few moments later, a shout arose behind him, and the sound of heavily armored dwarves could be heard running up to aid him, having been inspired by his bravery. Calder lost track of how many the dark elf killed or even which way he was facing in regard to the lay of the land. All he saw was enemy after enemy, cut and pierced by the blue flames surrounding the elf's blades. The chaos stopped and the elf came to a sudden halt as a hand grasped his shoulder and the wood elf's voice uttered an elvish command. He seemed to stagger slightly, as if the momentum of his body and mind had been so caught up in the battle that he was unable to stop their forward movement. The dwarves cheered as the remaining enemies scattered. They were diminished greatly with no way of gaining reinforcements through the Sphinx Gate. Calder shifted unpleasantly in his sleep, and his vision shifted to that of the wood elf as she made her way back into the fortress. The dwarf lord stopped her and asked about the burning blades and how such things could be crafted. The flames cannot be separated from the wielder, was her only reply before continuing on. The battle over and the dwarven settlement relatively safe, Calder finally felt himself relax and release his grip on the elves' minds. Darkness greeted Calder's eyes as they opened slowly. His head and stomach felt better, but his joints were now stiff and sore from laying awkwardly in the pile of hay for so long. With a grimace and a groan, he heaved himself to his feet and rubbed his neck. He made his way back to the great hall with a somewhat unsteady gait as his stiff joints reluctantly allowed him to move. He wandered through the kitchens and into the great hall via the side entrance. Huddled near the throne were the dwarf lord and his 2 counselors. They were examining something between them. "Are you sure they won't wake up?" said the black-bearded one. "I told you, they'll be out for days. The poison induces an almost death-like sleep from which they can only be awakened by the antidote," replied Ildar. The dwarf lord examined something in his hands. "We may not be able to obtain the secret of Briad's power, but we can at least obtain the secret behind these blades." He stretched out his arm and made several slashes and stabs with a familiar-looking short sword. The blades remained as plain, well-crafted steel without a trace of blue flame. "What did you do?" asked Calder as he stepped into the light. The 3 dwarves turned to look at him with surprise that quickly turned to glares. "We must not be dependent on or trust the elves," said Ildar. "They use us as pawns in their great wars," said Cole. "We shall either decipher their secrets or pry them out," declared the dwarf lord, as he closely examined the swords for markings or mechanisms. He turned to his counselors. "Even as they sleep, I want them bound and taken to the dungeon. We will start with the young one first. Take only the most loyal guards with you. The young one seems especially to have bewitched many of our kin." The 2 counselors bowed to their lord. A loud bang drew all attention to the doors of the great hall as one of the dwarf guards came flying through. The now open doorway was quickly darkened by the figure of the dark elf as he strode toward the 3. Calder stepped back to separate himself from them. The dark elf carried the dwarf guard's axe in his right hand. He clenched his fist around the wooden handle, and the whole axe burst into blue flame. The shadows in the great hall lengthened and deepened as the elf continued forward. Cole stepped forward and began to draw his own axe to fight. The elf threw his and embedded it into the counselor's skull. Ildar stepped forward, but the elf was on him before he could draw his weapon. One hand stopped the dwarf from pulling his warhammer free, while the other latched tight on his throat and began to pierce between the tendons to crush the windpipe. Calder could see a strange mix of rage and pleasure in the elf's expression. A commanding voice gave the young elf pause. Calder turned to see the wood elf standing in the doorway. The dark elf turned his head, without releasing his prey, and shouted something back in Elvish to the female. She replied, and he released the nearly dead dwarf, who fell to the ground with a thud. "Return what you have stolen," ordered the wood elf to the dwarf lord. "How dare you come into my hall and give me orders?" roared the dwarf, gripping both swords as if he might use them himself. "If you return what you stole, we will leave without incident and never return. There will not be any further retribution for your betrayal, or for your murder of a high elf." The dark elf glared at the dwarf lord with murderous intent, and the dwarf glared back in proud defiance. "I saw what your counselor did to the high elf," said Calder, stepping forward. "Your people murdered one of theirs and poisoned the others to steal from them. We can't afford more enemies." The dwarf lord turned his ire on Calder. "You have no right to tell me what to do. I am lord of this hall and of these lands. My authority is absolute, and no one, not some damned elf or self-important forest trash, will defy me." Calder's anger rose within him and he stepped forward, slamming his foot into the cold earth and bellowing as he did, "Enough." The ground beneath the dwarf lord shook and he fell to his knees with a gasp as his eyes widened. Calder took advantage of his shock to relieve him of the swords. He returned them to the dark elf, bowing his head and uttering an apology as he did so. The wood elf thanked him, and the 2 elves turned and left in silence. Once they were both gone from the great hall, Calder turned to the fallen dwarf lord. There were ways to rightfully depose him within their culture, but Calder did not look forward to it. He was getting too old for this. The old dwarf approached the dwarf lord, reached out, grabbed him by the hair, and dragged him from the great hole. The dwarf lord tried to struggle, but Calder was firmly rooted to the earth with each step he took. He hoped his people would understand and that the dwarves as a whole would not suffer for the mistakes of a few. Did you like the story? Recommend it to a friend. Did you hate the story? Recommend it to an enemy. Best of all, don't tell them how you felt about it first.